Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to continue our exploration of the Morgan affair. So today we're going to continue this series, and again, we're tearing this apart. We did the overview, we've looked at Morgan, we've looked at Miller in the last 3 episodes. Today we look at Samuel Greene, and he's going to be problematic, but we'll get to that. And the next episode, we'll be looking at Daniel Johns and the role of the Masons in this whole thing. The final episode, we'll be looking at what possibly happened to William Morgan. So today, we're going to focus on Samuel Greene. He is a brother of the lodge, at least at the time that these events are happening. He acts as a witness with knowledge of both sides of the conflict. But most of the information we get has a significant bias because a lot of it is coming from Greene's own book. He writes one known as The Broken Seal, or Personal Reminiscences of the Morgan Abduction and Murder. You can tell from the title, we've got some bias here. So he's profiting off his memoir and providing an outside view, possibly to make him look good. He basically says, look, I'm not involved on either side. I'm just a really good reporter. And so everything we see must be taken with a grain of salt coming from Greene. He is publishing this book. He's going to step away from the lodge very quickly after this happens. He's going to become a key figure in the New York Anti-Masonic Party. And so anything we see has to be assumed to have some level of bias to it. And as always, my goal here is to breathe some life into this often dry history. Try and tease things out, nuance things, so that we get past the melodrama of good and evil and we recognize that everyone is working based on their conception of what's going on their ideology, on their ideals, and not because they're good or evil. It's the Mosaic pavement. It goes deeper than the social construct, the simple categories. So, let's look at Samuel Greene. In terms of early life, at 21, he's a teacher. He runs a pub before he moves to Batavia in 1822. Ooh, a teacher who became a bartender because they make more money and get slightly more respect. That's shocking. Okay, it's a joke, but still. So he opens this pub in Batavia known as the Country House. And he's seen as a successful man, a mover and a shaker. He solicits to join the lodge because of his prominence in the community. And Ebenezer Mix, a local judge, will be the equivalent of his signer. He proposes him for membership. In January of 1826, so we're 7-8 months from the disappearance, Samuel Greene, then aged 38, is initiated and entered apprentice. William Seaver is the worshipful master of the lodge, and he's being initiated at Batavia. Who should help mentor him but William Morgan, who mentors Greene through the examinations. And he's frequently found drinking a pint at Greene's pub while working Greene through his paces. Morgan was also his neighbor for a time. Greene goes through the fellowcraft and eventually the Master Mason the same night a week later. This was common at the time. It's not common today. It would never happen today because of what happens during the Civil War, which you may or may not get in another podcast. His wife, Susan, Greene's wife, Susan, does not like the Masons all that much. So she's not spitting with the Masons. And that, along with his, quote, contempt for what he saw as pretentious men engaging in self-congratulatory ceremonies, leads Greene to quietly withdraw from lodge life. He's one of those guys who kind of just disappears. He just doesn't show up. It's not that big of a deal, but it happens so close to the disappearance that he's still seen as an active member. He's one of those guys who still have his name on the tip of your tongue. You go, oh yeah, that guy. We gotta go let him know what's going on. And that is what's going to bring him into our story. So by July of 1826, 2 months to the disappearance, only 6 months since Greene has joined the lodge, it's now been over 2 months since Greene has set foot in the lodge, and he receives a summons to lodge. Quote, business of a very important character was to come before the body. So he arrives, and he finds the usual cast of characters in their chairs. He does notice that Ebenezer Mix, his signer, looked like Atlas with the weight of the world on his shoulders. It would be Mix who is called upon to deliver the news. He gets up and says, quote, William Morgan is presently involved in writing out the mysteries of Freemasonry. Quoting Defoe, there was a gasp. I love that sort of thing because I've never been in a lodge where there was a gasp. Murmurs on occasion, someone stops snoring, but usually not a gasp. Quote, David C. Miller, editor and publisher of the Republican Advocate, has been contracted to publish Morgan's writings in book form. Despite being told they were there in Masonry to subdue their passions, here the most senior members were ranting like madmen, according to Greene, exposing their unbridled passions to junior members of the lodge. Order was only restored when the master, William Seaver, bangs the gavel. Greene saw enough for him to be concerned for his neighbor and mentor, William Morgan. Morgan was referred to as a, quote, wicked and perjured wench who ought to receive the penalties of the oath which had been taken and broken. Greene believed pecuniary interests, were part of Morgan's goal. So in other words, it's all about the money. Greene hoped that the chest puffing was an overzealous display made by men who felt slighted and betrayed, and he felt that the speeches that followed could only be pre-planned, well prepared to raise the ire of those present. Greene could not believe the question was addressed. Quote, should Morgan be taken away and executed? Would Masons take it to heart? The answer was more disturbing. The craft should rejoice that no trace of the vile wretch should be found. It was clear to Greene that the entire endeavor was carefully illustrated to be broken up so that no single Mason could be accused of conspiring to deal with the problem. What would happen throughout this meeting is one brother would make part of a statement and it would be completed by other Masons. So no individual can be said to have brought up the original idea. It's the same concept behind, stoning in the Bible, where the entire community was required to show up and everyone had to cast a stone. You didn't have a choice. You had to do this because that way whoever threw the fatal stone lacked the guilt. It was a community act, not an individual act. And that's very much what's happening here within the lodge. But no clear decision is made. They're not saying, oh yeah, let's absolutely go out and kidnap him. That's not what's happening here. These are those broad discussions. This is the first time it's coming up, at least at Batavia. When William Seaver left the master's chair to address his lodge in a series of rapidly asked questions, quote, who is your governor? Who are your military officers? Who are your sheriffs? Who are your judges and your jurors and your county clerks? Who are your constables and justices of the peace? Seaver asked, as he rounded the room, pausing with each question to look into the eyes of the most junior Master Masons. After allowing the previously asked questions to sink in, Seaver asked his brethren the following question: what can a mouse do with a lion? Seaver knew there was great truth in his introductory lines of questioning, all of which were answerable with a single word: Freemasons. In this area, Freemasons hold all those positions. DeWitt Clinton is the governor of New York. He's a prominent Mason who had served as Grand Master of Masons, Grand High Priest of the Royal Arch, Grand Commander of the Knights Templar, and was set to be elected to serve in his third term as General Grand High Priest of the General Grand Chapter of the United States. Clinton was arguably the most powerful man in Masonry, at least in New York State. But there was more that the lodge could count on should they move against Morgan and Miller. Many of the state's sheriffs were Freemasons, including Genesee County Sheriff William Thompson, a member of Batavia Lodge, who was grand juries were selected by the county sheriff. Quote, a fact that could only play in the craft's favor. Weaver concluded his lecture, continuing to focus on newer Masons in the lodge. Quote, think of your power, he says. What cannot you do when guarded our secrets? Or guarded by our secrets? So this entire meeting is set up by Greene as incredibly inflammatory. The Masons basically sitting there and going, we should do this. Who should do this? We should do this. They're not going to give names. They're not trying to encourage a single brother to do a single thing. Rather, this is sort of a development of community ideal, and it's probably being run by Seaver, Mix, and others to have this end. And as we'll see in a future episode, it may not be entirely Batavia Lodge running this in the background. There may be another body involved, but we'll get to that. So August 15, we're a month before the disappearance. The Morgan issue is raised in the lodge, and Greene believes that more is going on among Royal Arch membership, and we know that that is the case, and we will talk about it in a couple of episodes. An ad had already run in the Kandahiga paper labeling Morgan a dangerous swindler. All had gathered to hear the words of Governor Clinton to the craft. And this is a quote coming secondhand. We don't have the letter. Quote, you must suppress the secrets of Masonry at the expense of blood and treasure, the governor's letter began. But be careful to observe secrecy. But if you are detected, you shall be protected. If you are convicted, you shall be pardoned, for I have pardoning power. Greene thought that the governor's obligation to the people would ultimately outweigh his commitment to the craft, and we've heard that sentiment before from Morgan. The idea that, hey, no one's really going to go through with this. And think about it, if you were sitting in lodge and you overheard this conversation, you're not going to sit there and go, oh my gosh, these brothers really are serious. They're going to do something. You're going to go, oh, this is a bunch of chest puffing and it sounds good and it feels good. But at the end of the day, we're going to sit here 6 months later and complain that this book was published. Let's be honest. People are reasonable, and that's the assumption most of us make. The problem is people are reasonable. Groups are not. When you put people together in groups, things break down. And that's what we're going to see. Now, to this end, Governor Clinton had unexpectedly visited Batavia, only to leave abruptly the same day. Rob Morris and other historians question the authenticity of the letter, however. Although on the other side, its existence is acknowledged by several affidavits sent to Governor Clinton that seemed to have been acted on at the time. A brother by the name of Ganson, who will come up later, was to answer to the accusation that he was responsible for the letter. So there's question as to whether or not this letter ever actually exists, or did someone come up with the letter to make everyone feel better? Hey, the law's on our side, it's fine, let's go. Creating false pretense for their actions. August 20th. Sam Greene visited Morgan to inform him that based on several meetings Greene had attended, he believes that both Morgan and Miller are in particular danger. Morgan doesn't believe him, as we've said, as we've seen, and thought that the Masons were simply trying to vex and annoy him. They're just trying to shut this thing down. Quote, they won't go any further than this, Morgan told Greene. Quote, the laws of this country will have more influence over members of the lodge than their Masonic oath. Let's translate that. People will be reasonable. At the end of the day, no one's actually going to do anything. And we've all heard that, or at least thought that, in various circumstances. Quote, I used to think the same, Morgan, but I do not believe that the intention is now to use violence. I do believe that the intention is now to use violence. You should be strictly on your guard with the movements going on about you. So Greene is going, no, you need to understand things are getting really ugly in the lodge. Morgan, of course, has no idea what's going on in the lodge. Greene does. Greene's been witness to it. Now we move to September 8th, the day of the first fire, or the first attempt of a fire at Morgan's Press. The Lodge messenger had been very direct in telling Greene that 300 Masons were coming to Batavia to burn David Miller's office to the ground. Greene still had faith in the Lodge. This is coming from Defoe, page 85 or so. He had written an anonymous letter in the spirit of the times, hoping to quell the devious plot, but to no avail. He worried that warning Miller would lead to his own business becoming a target of Masonic retribution. So he decides to attempt to walk the tightrope between Lodge and Miller. He first went to see Sheriff Thompson, although the sheriff was clearly loyal to the Lodge, and reminded Greene of his obligation to the craft. The same happened when a few Masons he tried to talk to after meeting with Sheriff Thompson. So he decides that he needs to deliver a message to Miller. And so Greene takes a piece of paper. He wrote what was planned and instructed the receiver to copy the contents and burn the original. This is to avoid Greene's handwriting being recognized. Small town, everything is handwritten. You could definitely recognize someone's handwriting. Rolling the note into a ball, he puts it in his pocket and set off to see George Harris, the silversmith. Greene dropped the note on Harris's desk and leaves, hoping Harris will pass on the message. By the way, someone else, James Tosley, may have delivered a similar note or the original. The point is somewhat muddy aside from Greene's memoir. Greene claims that he did it, but no one else sees that. So it may be him, it may be someone else. Again, he's writing a memoir, and all of this is in there, so you have every reason to make yourself look good under the circumstances. By September 11th, the day that Morgan is going to be arrested, I believe, let me double check that here, because I get my dates mixed up too on a regular. So yes, Morgan is arrested on September 11th and taken out of Batavia. So Greene turns down a summons to go to Leroy, where the Masons from a number of lodges were meeting to discuss the Morgan issue. He also refuses to provide horses or carriages to those attending, and there are no apparent repercussions, which sounds odd. If a lodge sends a messenger to someone and says, hey, we need this, and they turn him down, and they turn down going to the meeting, you would think that that would raise some suspicions, but apparently not. So that may actually mean that what happens is Greene does go to the meeting, or Greene does provide horses, and he just doesn't want to say it in the memoir. Again, this is my reading of the situation, not necessarily something that we're seeing elsewhere. So September 12th. Morgan's disappearing on this day. Miller's being kidnapped on this day. And a lodge messenger appears at Greene's door and asks Greene to assemble to the east end of the village at noon. Quote, they will be going to march on David Miller's print shop at 1 o'clock sharp. Once there, the mob will seize Miller and the manuscript. Greene was to deliver the key to a local church to a brother so the bell could be rung to assemble everyone at noon. He made a stop to see the silversmith, George Harris, to get a message to Miller. The message passed on the information about the impending attack to Miller. This is the idea, getting across the idea that Miller knows the attack is coming. This may be why he decides to stand down, because he knows that law enforcement is involved, even if they're Masonic. So Greene goes home and tells his wife Susan about his expectation of violence, and there's this interaction between them as discussed in Defoe. He also tells her he had been attending meetings while passing information to Miller, putting him in a precarious position. Quote, if they should in any way discover what I've done, my life will be in danger. Susan, quote, Samuel, you don't really believe the Masons will come to the village in open daylight and destroy someone's property, do you? I just have to say, that quote from Susan, again from the memoir, being written here in Defoe, is not what you would expect. It's very much a heroic thing. You can imagine that would be something along the line, this interaction would be, okay, I'm in trouble, here's why, and the wife going, well, they're not actually going to do anything, are they? But he's kind of playing it up a little bit. Continuing on. Samuel, just so, my dear, if you stay where you are sitting long enough, you will see it being done. At this point, Merrill, a local Mason, comes to Greene's door. Merrill, quote, "Greene, you must be ready to turn out. The brethren are coming down. If you know anything, you must know nothing. You can swear one way as well as another." Merrill left, walked a few steps, turned back to say, "There is a traitor in the camp, and we shall find him." Okay, let's be honest. If the Masons thought that there was a traitor in the camp, if they thought that one of their brothers was informing on them to Miller and Morgan, they would have done something already. They wouldn't be coming to Greene. Not unless this is some super spy thriller, and I doubt it, in a small town in upstate New York in the 19th century. So let's be honest. That's probably another statement that's been added or exaggerated by Greene. So Greene closes the door and returns inside to sit with Susan for several minutes before they see 60 to 70 men, far short of the 300 that we heard earlier, coming up the road carrying clubs. Greene goes out, leaving Susan in the house, watching from an upstairs window, and he went after the mob had passed to see where they are going. She sees Miller being dragged by two men through the street. She runs out to Samuel, who's apparently still standing in the road, who says he needs to see Mr. Harris. We've got to do something about this. Now, if the lodge didn't know there was a problem, this interaction would make it clear. If you're in that mob and you're looking down the road and you're going, why is Greene standing in the middle of the road over there with his wife and not over here with us? This would raise suspicions. Where doesn't it raise suspicions? When you're making yourself look good in a memoir or in depositions after the fact. But leaving that aside, let's continue on. So, he writes another note. He crumples in his pocket, tells his wife he will return shortly. He tosses the note across George Harris's desk. It reads, "Follow me." Harris gets up and follows Greene through the back alleys to Greene's home. And they talk through his kitchen window. Greene inside, Harris outside. They're setting up again like these two people are just there sort of talking out of the side of their mouths, making it look like nothing's going on, although it would be pretty odd to have someone just randomly standing outside your kitchen window. Harris, Greene said, they have Miller now too. We have to do something immediately. Harris, what can we do about it? Greene, I don't know, Harris. But I feel it's our duty to do all in our power to rescue Mr. Miller. Harris, well, there's no use finding a magistrate. They all have been subpoenaed to act as witnesses in Bethany, referring to another case, another situation. Greene, no, but you should go and see that Theodore Talbot, the attorney that turns up to help rescue Miller, the lawyer, and hire him to make use of all possible forms of the law for Miller's recovery. Harris sets off to find Talbot. At this point, Greene disappears from the story, probably because he had done everything in his power. However, his later testimony and book do a great deal to shape our impression of the Morgan affair and its actors. Whether he writes a self-aggrandizing account or is fairly neutral is always a question. But he does provide powerful witness accounts of both sides through those faithful days of August and September. The reason you bring in a witness like this, or the reason I wanted to look at a witness like this, even though there are clearly going to be biases given everything else that's going to happen and has happened with Greene, is even though he's altering things, there is some basis in truth. He is giving us information that we might not otherwise have. It gives us a third-person account, someone who's not part of the disappearance. He's not trying to get Morgan out of town. He's not trying to attack Miller, but he's also not working in their favor necessarily. He sets himself up to be that person who's just always doing the right thing. And while that may be unlikely, it does mean that there's some air of truth. People don't usually create complete fabrications. Okay, most people don't. So what's going to happen here is Greene is going to go on. He's going to leave the lodge. He's going to distance himself from the lodge within months of the disappearance. And he's going to go on to be involved in the anti-Masonic party. And then he's going to write the book Broken Seal in 1873, so 50 years later, as a memoir, trying to kind of cash in on his role in all of this after all the anti-Masonic fervor and everything else had died out. And so it's questionable, but at the same time, it's really key. It's key to understanding or having a new perspective to what's going on. So, now that we've looked at Greene, we've looked at Miller, and we've looked at Morgan, there's someone we still have to look at, which is the Lodge as a whole. And what I'm going to do is look at numerous members. The next episode will look at several members, their interactions with Morgan as things progress, so that we get a sense of the Lodge. And not just the Lodge. When I say the Lodge, everyone assumes that we're talking about just Batavia Lodge, but we're not. There's several Masonic entities all working together in this whole situation. And so the next episode, we're going to look at the perspective of the Masons in part 5 of the Morgan Affair. Thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Lidke, and the entire Further Light team on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.